Welcome back, historians. Over the past week, we've explored how slavery created deep divisions in our nation, tensions that would ultimately shape America's future. Today, we reach the final chapter of this discussion. We'll be discussing John Brown's raid, the election of 1860, and the start of the Civil War. As we close out Slavery Divides a Nation, we'll connect the dots and see how these conflicts set the stage for the biggest turning point in U.S. history. So let's dive in. All right, by the late 1850s, tensions between the North and the South were at an all-time high. One of the events that pushed the nation even closer to war was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. So who was John Brown? Well, Brown was a radical abolitionist, meaning he was extremely passionate about ending slavery. He believed that slavery was a great moral evil and that he was chosen by God to help end it. He had already been involved in violent clashes over slavery in Kansas, and now he was ready to take his fight to the east. John Brown put together a small group of men, including 5 African Americans, and set his sights on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan? To seize weapons from a federal arsenal, a government storage site for guns and ammunition. Brown hoped that once he took control of the arsenal, enslaved people in the area would join him in an armed rebellion. He wanted to spark a movement that would spread across the South and lead to the end of slavery. At first, Brown's plan seemed to be working. His men successfully captured the arsenal, but there was one big problem. The mass uprising he expected never happened. There were very few enslaved people in Harper's Ferry, and those who did live nearby were either too afraid or simply unaware of what Brown was trying to do. Meanwhile, word of the raid spread fast, and it wasn't long before the U.S. military arrived to put an end to it. A group of Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would later become a famous Confederate general, stormed the arsenal. Brown and his men fought back, but they were quickly overwhelmed. 10 of Brown's followers were killed, and he was captured alive. The raid was now over. John Brown was put on trial for treason, murder, and trying to start a slave rebellion. Most people in both the North and South thought his plan was reckless and doomed from the start. But something surprising happened during the trial. Instead of acting wild or unhinged, Brown remained calm and dignified. He used the courtroom as a stage to explain why he did what he did. He believed slavery was evil and that he was willing to die to end it. The court found him guilty and he was sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, December 2nd, 1859, church bells rang throughout the North in his honor. To many Northerners, John Brown became a martyr, which is someone who dies for a cause they believe in. To many Southerners, however, he was a dangerous criminal who proved that abolitionists would stop at nothing, even violence, to destroy their way of life. John Brown's raid didn't free any enslaved people, but it did something else. It made the division between the North and the South even deeper. The South became more convinced that the North wanted to end slavery by any means necessary, and the North saw Brown as a symbol of the fight against slavery. Less than 2 years later, the Civil War would begin. In 1860, all eyes were on the upcoming presidential election. Tensions between the North and the South had been rising for years, and now the future of the country seemed to hang in the balance. The Republican Party held its national convention in Chicago, Illinois. Thousands of people packed the city's hotels. Every single one of these hotels was full. Some people even had to sleep on billiard tables, which is a pool table, because there was nowhere else to stay. The big question on everybody's mind: who would win the Republican nomination? Most assumed it would be William Seward from New York, a well-known politician with strong anti-slavery views. But to many people's surprise, the nomination went to a relatively unknown lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party was falling apart. Their convention was held in Charleston, South Carolina, but it quickly turned into a disaster. Northern and Southern Democrats could not agree on a candidate. The issue? Slavery in new territories. Northern Democrats picked Stephen Douglas as their candidate, but Southern Democrats refused to support him. Instead, they chose John Breckinridge of Kentucky, who supported slavery. This split weakened the party and made it easier for Lincoln to win. Another group of Americans, hoping to avoid war, formed a new political party called the Constitutional Union Party. That's a mouthful. Try saying that 3 times fast. Their only goal was to keep the country together, and they nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Despite the divided election, Lincoln's victory seemed almost certain. Stephen Douglas saw what was coming. He knew Lincoln would win, but he still urged the South to accept the results and remain in the Union, saying, "No matter who is elected, we must stay together." But not everybody agreed with him. When the votes were counted, it was official. Abraham Lincoln was the next president of the United States. He carried every northern state and won without a single southern electoral vote. In fact, in 10 southern states, his name wasn't even on the ballot. The North simply had more people, which meant they had more electoral votes, and that decided the outcome. For many in the South, Lincoln's election felt like the final straw. They believed that they had lost their voice in the national government. If the North could elect a president without any Southern support, what did that mean for their way of life, especially when it came to slavery? Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky made a last attempt to keep the country together. He proposed a compromise: extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific Ocean and pass an amendment guaranteeing slavery would always be protected in the South. But by this point, it was too late. Very few people supported his idea. To many Southerners, it didn't matter what Lincoln actually said or believed. They were convinced that an abolitionist was now in the White House and that slavery would soon be abolished everywhere. Some saw secession, which is breaking away from the Union, as the only option. At the same time, most Northerners, especially Republicans, refused to back down. They had won the election fairly, and they weren't about to give up on what they had fought for. The country was on the edge of something dangerous. What would happen next? In just a few months, one Southern state after another would make their decision, and the United States would never be the same again. By the time Lincoln was elected in 1860, tensions between the North and the South were at a boiling point. Many Southerners felt like they had the right to leave the Union, just as the American colonies had left Great Britain. They believed Lincoln was going to take away their way of life, including slavery, and they weren't about to let that happen. So, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede. Not long after, 6 more states, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, also followed. By February 1861, they had formed their own government, calling themselves the Confederate States of America. The South justified secession by pointing to the Declaration of Independence, which says that people have the right to change or get rid of a government that no longer protects their rights. But here's the catch: Lincoln and many Northerners didn't see it that way. To them, the Union was meant to last forever, and breaking away wasn't an option. When Lincoln finally became president on March 4th, 1861, he knew he had a serious crisis on his hand. In his inaugural address, he made it clear no state can lawfully get out of the Union. But he also promised that he wasn't going to start a war. The South would have to fire the first shot if they wanted a fight. And that's exactly what happened. The Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, at Fort Sumter, a U.S. military fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Confederate soldiers surrounded the fort and demanded that the U.S. troops inside surrender. When they refused, the Confederates opened fire. People in Charleston gathered on rooftops to watch, treating it like it was a fireworks show. They had no idea that those fireworks were the first shots of a brutal war that would last for 4 long years and claim the lives of over 600,000 Americans. The Battle of Fort Sumter lasted for 34 hours, and in the end, the Union troops inside had no choice but to surrender. The Confederacy had won the first battle, but the war was just beginning. Now, in response, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to help put down the rebellion, and that's when things really escalated. Four more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, decided to join the Confederacy, bringing the total to 11 seceded states. Both sides were now preparing for a long and bloody conflict that would decide the future of the United States. Well, that brings us to the end of Slavery Divides a Nation. We've seen how tensions over slavery fractured the country, making conflict inevitable. But what happens when words and compromises are no longer enough? Next, we'll be diving into the Civil War, the fight that would change America forever. Until then, though, remember, what do I tell you every time? The past shaped today, but you shape tomorrow. Make it count. Take care. Bye bye.